thank you all for joining me today. Let's turn your world upside down as we venture into the unknown. So hold on, we're departing your old beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy your possibility. The ancient Egyptian god Thoth has long been associated with wisdom and the transmission of ancient knowledge. He was credited by the Egyptians as the inventor of writing and is thought to be the author of the famed Emerald Tablets. Legend tells us that Thoth, a survivor of Atlantis, lived for about 16,000 years, where he ruled ancient Egypt from approximately 50,000 BC to 36,000 BC. It's also believed that he transmitted the knowledge and ancient wisdom of the Atlantean race down through the ages, which has been preserved in many esoteric traditions today. Who was Thoth? What is this ancient wisdom? And why did our ancestors, recent and ones from our distant past, revere and preserve this seemingly arcane knowledge? To help sort this all out, we'll be speaking with Mark Stavish. Mark, the Director of Studies for the Institute of Hermetic Studies, is a lifelong student of esotericism with over 25 years' experience in comparative religion, philosophy, psychology, and mysticism, with an emphasis on traditional Western esotericism. His articles have appeared in academic, specialty, and mass market publications specializing in spiritual studies, making Mark one of the leading authorities in Hermeticism today. His webpage is hermeticinstitute.org, so please welcome Mark Stavish. Hey Mark, how are you doing?
Very good. How are you?
I am doing great. It is wonderful to have you back on the show. You've been with us several times, and I just love delving into the knowledge that you have, because it's like you just pack it all in and have it just readily available for anyone that needs to glean your information. So thank you for all that you do.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
So let's start here. Many people have heard of the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, but who is Thoth? Where did he come from?
Well, whenever we deal with this, we have two things to look at. One is mythology and one is history. And often it gets very confused which is which. So what we're looking at really is an Egyptian god, okay, Tahuti, who becomes Thoth and is often very later on amalgamated with the Greek god Mercury. So we often see later on the Thoth Hermes, the Greek god Hermes, the Roman god Mercury, Mercurius. So we often see Thoth Hermes, Hermes Mercurius, this typical syncretic approach to deities that we see across the Middle East. So Thoth is constantly changing. So if I ever tell you this is Thoth, there's going to be someone else says, yeah, but this is Thoth as well, or this is his other name. Same with all of the ancient gods. So just keep that in mind, that whatever I say, there's always something else. Well, he's the god of wisdom. Okay, that's what we're most concerned about. Along with, he wrote down the words of Thoth, one of the creator gods of Memphis. Okay, now all these gods cycle through. It's kind of like they get promoted and demoted over the millennia. So at one time, Thoth was a creator god, but that kind of gets forgotten because I guess he got demoted at some point. So you see all this cycling through. But he wrote down the words, and those became the words of creation, and those became the words of magic. And he wrote them down in a mythical 42 books, who were also guarded by his wife, Ma'at, or Truth. So that is what we're concerned with. That is the beginning of Thoth. That is the beginning of Hermes. And the whole story just continues from there. And there's many stories. And what we're concerned with is that as the god of wisdom, he is said to hold the keys to ancient magic. Now, for the Egyptians, and this is really important, there was no difference between religion and magic. They didn't really have a word for religion. There was just magic and magical power, or haku. So he had it all. He was one of the insiders.
Well,
Go ahead.
Well, and it sounds like the material that he did document could be parallel to something like the Vedas, which is the empirical wisdom of Hindu cosmology. Would you say that there's some kind of a parallel between the two?
Well, I'd go beyond parallel because from the region of the Mediterranean to China, which we call the Silk Road, there was a tremendous amount of cross fertilization of ideas. We tend to forget this. A lot of folks openly want to ignore it. Okay, but there was a tremendous fertilization of ideas, particularly from India. Okay, and with that later on, even into India and Tibet. Um, so you have just all these folks talking to each other and coming up with things and practicing different practices and comparing. And then what they do is they give it a name or of a cult or a god or a goddess or a sect, as we like to think of. But at their time and place, they weren't as hermetically sealed as we like to think they were. They were very open and porous.
Do you think that the Indian tradition came first, or do you think the Egyptian tradition came first, or do you think that they rose in a parallel time frame?
Well, I'd have to actually check some dates here, and so I'm not going to make a definitive statement on that.
Okay.
But to look at the words of John Anthony West, the fellow who pointed out to us that the Sphinx is, roughly 25,000 years old based on geology, okay, rather than on anything on archaeology, which means he was using real science rather than guesstimates. Okay, he said if we look at the Egyptian culture of the pharaonic culture is at its high point and then only descends downward. And yet prior to the pharaonic culture, we have nothing, or very little. So how did this fully intact, fully developed culture come to exist? That's a question he positions, and I'll do that as well. I'll throw that out there to you. And we see many people saying that ancient Egypt prior to the pharaonic period was influenced by folks who came out of the Caucasus Mountains or possibly out of what is now would be Iran, the Indo-Iranian era period. So take your pick. We do know from the French authority, Alain Danlou, he spoke openly about that cross-fertilization between Greece, not as much Egypt, but he spoke a lot about Greece and India between Dionysius and Shiva. So it's there. People are talking. People are comparing. People are spreading ideas. And there was, by the way, a small Buddhist community in Alexandria at one point.
I never knew that. That's interesting. What about the whole Atlantis connection? I mean, do you think Atlantis existed, or this ancient race with advanced technology and advanced knowledge?
That's a question that we just have to look to what we know. And so far, we have no real evidence that a super civilization existed with the kind of technology that we're told. However, the idea of the cyclic rise and falls of civilizations is well embedded in both Greek thought. We see it even mentioned to some degree in the Old Testament, but also particularly in Indian thought. The ages or the yugas, the periods in which things cycle through. We go from Golden Age, the Silver Age, to the Bronze Age, to the Iron Age. And you see that in alchemy later on as well. Since we're talking about Hermeticism, we see that referenced again in Hermeticism, in alchemy. We see that reference particularly by the enigmatic French alchemist Pocanelli in his works, or his works attributed to him. And you see that in Tibetan Buddhism, particularly if any of those are the Nyingma sect. They always say, Padmasambhava, my only refuge in this dark and desolate age. Okay, what they're referring to there is the Kali Yuga, or the last of those 4 ages. Okay, so that notion of cyclic comings and goings of civilizations, that had existed for quite some time. So for the Greeks to just talk about it in terms of Atlantis, nothing new.
Okay. Well, and we're in the Kali Yuga. According to Indian tradition, we're in that Kali Yuga now, which is kind of scary. I mean, what do you think of that? What do you think of humanity being in this quote unquote dark age of information? Even though we have all of this technology, but from an ancient perspective, we really are in a dark age.
Well, and again, well, you look at the stories that are told with this, as one Lama said to me, and these are just figures for teaching that they give. During the golden age, everything was perfect, and maybe 95% of the population was practiced spirituality, and we even have to define what do we mean by that, okay? Because our understanding of that may be very different. And then that degrades, okay? And then in the Silver Age, it's something like, they throw a figure out, it's like 25% or 75% of the population practices spirituality. And then like in the Bronze Age, it's 50%. And then on these numbers somehow eventually reverse, where it's now in the Kali Yuga, only 5% of the population or so is interested in this kind of thing and practices it. And if we think of spirituality as understanding ourselves, nothing else other than that, just understanding myself, I think we can see that there's some truth to that. On the other hand, we have tremendous opportunity. That's the other side of the Kali Yuga. You see, in the Golden Age, and alchemy talks a lot about the Golden Age restored, by the way. That's why I'm bringing this up. Mm-hmm. Everything was very easy. Everything's very simple. You pretty much wished for it and you got it. There wasn't a lot of effort involved. So for anything to really change took a tremendous amount of time. Whereas here for us, any effort we put into change has a tremendous amount of value because it takes so much effort. And we really have to make serious decisions about this path, or any path we pick. What are we going to do with our time here on Earth? How are we going to best use it? So any decisions we make towards spirituality, because of course these systems believe in reincarnation, is in our best interest or is to our future benefit, they would say.
Interesting. I have
So
another
the Kali
question.
Yuga is mixed blessing.
It's definitely, well, everything's always a mixed blessing. One of the things that I have found with the whole concept of Thoth, whether he be a person or not, is the emerald tablets in themselves. People run around and say, oh, well, the emerald tablets say this. Do you think that the tablets are real, like actually tablets that have been lost at some point in time? Or do you think that it's just the wisdom that we have encapsulated into this notion of emerald tablets?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to the whole idea of Atlantis as well. That we have to look at what we tend to do in Western monotheistic dominated society, and I rarely say things like that, but you really have to stop and think about it, is there is a strong tendency to look at things in terms of right or wrong, truth or fiction. And because of that strong duality of this or that, we tend to miss the fact that things have many levels. Rabbis say, the Old Testament should be read on at least 4 levels. Some of the Sufis will say that their scripture should be read on 4 to 10 levels. Even the early church fathers talked about the multiple levels of meaning of scripture. So when we're dealing with something like the Emerald Tablet, we have to approach it from the same perspective, or we're just going to enter into a useless argument. So I have never seen a picture of the Emerald Tablets. I've seen illustrations of what is supposed to be it, courtesy Manly P. Hall, but no photograph. But what I do have is documentation going back to the Middle Ages, in which this idea of the Emerald Tablet is there. Now, first of all, we have to look at what is the emerald. What does that mean? And that has some really interesting ideas, particularly in reference to Lucifer and the fallen angel, the emerald that supposedly fell from his forehead during the descent. What does that mean in terms of human desire evolution, kind of like Prometheus, having to steal the fire of the gods? Okay, so we as individuals have to make an effort for our own becoming. That's the first thing. Okay, there's no, within the alchemical or hermetic mode, there's no salvation by grace. You are of your own. You are a son of your own deeds, as Elvis Slightly said. So with the Hermetic tablet, we see the most important and most often quoted section is, as above, so below, as below, so above, to accomplish the work of the one thing. Now, there are many translations on that. One of the other translations is, that which is above comes from that which is below, and that which is below comes from that which is above, to accomplish the work of the one thing.
I
So we
like
just
that one.
so if we just look at that and we say, okay, we're talking about an interrelationship of what is above, and that is always understood to be some kind of spiritual or subtle energetic domain, okay, the realm of the gods. What is below, meaning the physical world and the world of human beings, of matter. And then what is the work of the one thing? What is that? And that is well, that's it. This is the question that we have to discover and realize for ourselves. And within the Corpus Hermetica, it's very clear that each of us as individuals must make that effort to, if they say, if you will, conquer the realms of the gods, to get past, the other ways, the Gnostics would say, the demiurge, and to realize our true nature.
A little earlier, you mentioned Lucifer, which takes me to the whole notion of the fall of man, that we have in the Bible. Was that whole situation derived, I guess, so that we would have to learn to utilize this knowledge to bring us back to a different state, to use that effort, as you were talking about before, to bring us back to a more divine or enlightened state?
Well, yeah, if you look at different systems, if we want to go with a straight biblical interpretation, everything was good as long as you obeyed. And you obeyed out of ignorance and to some degree out of fear. And that's it's okay. If you look at other stories, it suggests that, in the beginning, this ignorance was the issue. There was nothing to know. In that peaceful state of Edenic bliss, there's nothing to know. Everything is self-reflective. That's the golden age. There's no problems. There really aren't. So when you step away from that and you take on a challenge, you step down in station, if you will. I mean, if you were in the golden age, you'd be a god. Well, to step down from that is a fall. So you go down. Jean Dubuis, the French alchemist, used to say, in the beginning, God was big and all-powerful and very stupid because there was nothing to know. Because if all you know is yourself, then there's nothing else to know. So the fall, so-called fall, was a choice to enter into this realm of duality. And that's what we're looking at is an attitude. See, you can be enlightened and still be here. It's not like you go anywhere. Jacobima said, we don't go anywhere. Heaven and hell are within us. That's a very difficult thing for people to grasp. Your state of awareness is what decides whether you're, we'll say, enlightened or suffering. It's a perspective. So the fall is a change of perspective. Duality is a change of perspective away from understanding the fundamental interrelationship. So yeah, it's taking on a big challenge. I'm going to make myself. I'm going to recreate myself in my own efforts. And you see that in the Gnostic myths with Sophia. Sophia falls, and there's a little bit left except some seed ideas which she feeds to her children. And then, of course, they take on the challenge of her.
Very interesting. So it sounds like we all have this opportunity within us, but the operative word is within us, and it's not because we got some new app for our iPhone or the latest widget that's available on the market.
Right. It's not externally oriented, although external supports are essential, and that's why we have religion. That's why we have various kinds of cult or magical operations or initiatic societies as external means. That's why we have books and programs like this to help people and to support them. But ultimately, it's an inner effort, an inner action within your own mind. That's why it's a cult. A cult means hidden from view. It's secret. It goes on within me. That's why it's hermetic. It's hermetically sealed. It's within me, within you, within everyone else. And we share a lot, but there's no even, and we can help one another, and we can even influence one another to some degree. Hence the notion of paranormal phenomenon abilities. But there's no welfare salvation.
But it seems like, books or shows like this or other places where people can get information could be likened to something like the Book of the Dead, or, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that is giving them kind of a process for them to discover it within themselves. Because I think, well, especially with where human society is today, we're not taught that, and I think there's a certain amount of education that needs to happen.
All right, that's, I said, people come to and they listen and watch shows like this, and they get ideas, and hopefully they'll take those ideas and they'll go somewhere and do more research, and then put effort. See, it's not just about accumulating ideas, and this is where people can become information junkies, where it becomes entertainment, infotainment, rather than a process or a path. And you have to find the path that you want to work on, and then you have to do it. And that's why it's called the great work, because you actually have to do it. Whether it's alchemy, or whether it's a system of meditation, or whether it's ritualistic ceremonial magic, or whatever it happens to be, your own effort.
But you said that foul 4-letter word, work. Mm-hmm. In all of these different traditions, I have always said, or often said, that, all of the paths to God lead to the same place. So when you look at these different esoteric traditions, do you find that ultimately they all lead you to the same place, even though the way you get there might be a little bit different?
Yes and no. I'll say no, because not all paths have the same function. And a perfect example would be that why one would undertake the study of astrology is not necessarily to understand the divine. It can be, and was deeply integrated into daily life, 3,000 years ago, or even in the Renaissance, but not now. Now it's treated as an abstraction. So not all paths lead to God. That's just very clear about that. Just as not all political aspects lead to what you might want, a political system you might want to live under. Okay. However, if we take the very long approach, then I'll say no experience is wasted. And that's a little different. So all the experiences which you gather in your journey ultimately become a means or methods for you deciding, how you're going to realize yourself and by what methods. So I hope that answers it.
It does. And I guess I see something like astrology as being a tool to help you understand and dig deeper into yourself and dig deeper into what's going on around you, but not as the work on the path, but just a way of gaining, side information to incorporate into that path.
Right, and that's why I bring it up, because we have some very narrow views about what constitutes a spiritual path. And if we just use the simple fourfold model, for example, you have devotional path. The devotional path is really the easiest way. That's the best for people. Then you have more demanding aesthetic practices, which often involve ceremonial magic or different forms of extreme yogas. They work too, okay? And we often think of those as the path. What we tend not to think of as a path, because there's a strong anti-intellectual current that is increasing, particularly among, has always been among the New Age movement, but even more so we see it spreading, is the idea that study is a path. In alchemy, they say ora et labora, or prayer and work. But there's also another phrase that says lege, 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 ora et labora, lege, 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 ora, lege et labora, meaning read, 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 pray, read again, and then get to work. Because in the reading, you have to know what you're doing. So
Hmm.
there is an intellectual component to this path, and that I've known many people who, through a kind of contemplative study, have been able to deeply immerse themselves in a lot of these philosophies, ideas, and experiences as a meditation. And we have to recognize that as a valid and worthwhile way too. And that works. It opens you up by the ideas that you place into your mind to study and meditation in that way, instead of just saying, oh, I've got to stare at this candle or this dot on the wall or visualize these divine forms or count off prayers on my rosary or mala. So in a way, there's as many paths to God as there are people, but we can identify useful ways. And then of course there's what we call karma yoga, okay, or work, and that is where everything you do, you dedicate to your ideal. Everything you do is constantly dedicated to your ideal, and that's an inner path, because that's your motivation, that you dedicate this work that you do to your ideal, and anyone can do that anywhere at any time.
And I would assume that would include the not so fun things that you have to do or encounter in your life. In Judaism, it would maybe be considered like a mitzvah, where you're doing it to revere God, and it doesn't really have anything to do with you.
Exactly, and of course it does. I mean, one of the notions, people have foolish notions about karma, which is simply cause and effect. So we're always affected by it because we're the ones doing it. You can't escape that. We're always the one benefiting by it because we're the ones doing it. Even if the other person doesn't benefit, we benefit from the fact that we simply did it. Uh, Vivekananda is pretty clear about that. But there you have these ideas, these paths. So everything becomes a path of service. Everything. Because you dedicate it to your ideal, which is your God. So that's the difference in many ways between, say, alchemy and chemistry, or alchemy and physics. It's not so much what is done, but the understanding it's done with, and the reason it's done. That's real esotericism. That's real occult.
See, this is good. You were talking about this path of intellectual wisdom, and I have to say, I think that's my path. I mean, I will read books and just hit upon a topic and just sit there and kind of go off into my little never land place and then come back, with this deeper wisdom tied to it.
Yes, I mean, we talk a lot about guided journeys, visualizations, path working, that kind of stuff. And when we think of that, we often think of it in a very formal way. I sit in my group or in my temple, and we turn the lights down and we burn some incense. But the reality is, you're doing that kind of practice all the time, and you're doing it every time you read. You're doing it every time you watch TV. You're doing it every time you play a video game or watch a movie or even listen to music, because these are ideas that are taking you somewhere. The difference is, when we think of it in terms of spirituality, we think that we've chosen the ideas and with a purpose, which is good. We've chosen to read this book. When you're reading, you're visualizing these things.
Mm-hmm.
These are ideas arising within your mind. It's not just words on a page. There's feelings that come with that. And that's the same as a guided visualization or journey, or some shamanic journey, or whatever you want, path working, whatever you want to call it. It can't have the same effect if you do it with that intention.
Excellent. So everybody start reading at least. Um,
And just be careful what you read. Yeah, I mean, really, honestly, this is where you get into it. If you're going to spend, an hour watching The Walking Dead, on Sunday nights, and then whatever else you're watching across the week, and then you think you're going to just, read some book on meditation, and that's going to clean the plate. Well, it's not. We have to be very careful what we put in, especially in the beginning.
Agreed. And I'll share my story. My goal from being very young was to become psychic. That's what I wanted to do from the time I was 12 years old, was I wanted to learn how to be psychic. And I
Sure.
started reading and reading and reading and studied astrology and numerology and tried to memorize the tarot, which never happened. And even though I read tarot cards as a psychic, but never could, my brain doesn't want to, spirit does not want me to memorize certain things. And that's something it doesn't want me to memorize. So it's like, okay. And it wasn't until I started studying at the Berkeley Psychic Institute that I realized it wasn't about the books. It was about the experience, and having this experience. And once that clicked in my mind, well, one, I realized that I had been having that experience my whole life, but no one ever explained that to me. No one ever connected the dots to say, well, when this happens or when you're in this state, you're having, a psychic experience or whatever kind of experience it is.
Yeah, one of the biggest problems we have when we get into this work is trying to figure out what is a genuine insight and not just the nonsense from our own brain. And people often ask me why dreams are so important, and I say dreams are important, and that's why I wrote, Between the Gates, and why you see often in the Renaissance literature and a lot of the historical literature the reference to dream states. A lot of the revelations take place in a dream where an angel shows up, like alchemical wedding of Krishna and Victorious and other things. And they say, well, how do I know if this dream was important? And I always say, well, did you know you were dreaming? No. Well, then it's probably not important. If it wasn't a lucid dream, it was just stuff bubbling around in your brain from the day. It may be anxiety, it may be nerves, it may be a whole bunch of pathology. It may just be a cold wind blowing off an open window. But it's not important. So, was the dream lucid? Did you know you were dreaming? If so, then something was important. The other part is, how do I know it's important to me? Well, if you're asking me, then it probably wasn't. And that's what happens. People take every little thing that floats up in front of their eyeballs when they close them and think it's a psychic vision. It's not. So what you have to begin to notice is the transition phases of meditative practice. And this is where meditative practice is critical to any kind of psychic phenomenon, any kind of occult phenomenon, because everything begins and ends within the framework of our own mind. So if your mind is calm and clear, and then ideas begin to arise in it, and they have a certain vitality or strength to them or a certain subtlety, you begin to notice that. You become familiar with how you communicate with yourself. Self unto self will speak. You become familiar with it. Okay, now you know. But without that meditative practice, without that effort, it's very easy to confuse whatever imagery is going through one's mind with an actual psychic communication. So that's the other point, is what's the fruit of it? If the communication bears fruit, then it has value. Someone said, they're joking about these channelers, and how they're always communicating with someone from beyond the grave. Now, the person from beyond the grave has gone through all this trouble to talk to them, and what do they talk to them about? But the most trivial and inane things. Now, I would think that if my grandmother were going to communicate to me, that it would be something far more important than the color of my drapes. So that's the other thing there. If it's trivial, it's not. It's just not. And therein lies the big rub too. So if it's important, you'll know it. If it's clear, dynamic, and lucid, you'll know it. And if it arises when you're coming out of meditation, because that's when you're calmest. Just like you have the most important dreams right before you wake up, that's when most likely this is something to pay attention to.
Excellent. As a reminder, if you're enjoying today's programming and want to hear more from Mark Stavich or our other amazing guests, become a Just Energy Radio Insider and access full shows commercial free and gain access to our over 9 years of show archives. Visit www.justenergyradio.com.